flight crew froze as a commanding voice rang out from the front of the cabin. A four-star general, his uniform heavy with medals, stood defiantly near the cockpit. "You're asking this man to move," he said, pointing toward the elderly veteran in economy. "That's a Silver Star recipient you just downgraded." His words cut through the hum of boarding chatter. What followed was a powerful reckoning at 35,000 feet, a moment where quiet dignity clashed with institutional indifference. But before we dive into this true story of injustice, advocacy, and redemption, comment where you're watching from. If respect for veterans matters to you, hit like and subscribe for more stories of honor finally recognized. Walt Thompson adjusted his neatly pressed jacket with one hand while holding tightly to the boarding pass with the other. He looked around the bustling terminal at JFK Airport, his posture straight, movements deliberate, and presence quiet yet unmistakable. He was the kind of man whose life left silent echoes, distinguished, respected, but too humble to draw attention to himself. He wore no uniform, but anyone paying attention could sense the discipline and quiet dignity that followed him like a shadow. He had arrived early, just as he always did, refusing assistance from the airline staff despite his noticeable limp. A war injury, long since healed physically, but never far from his thoughts. The limp was a subtle reminder of a firefight decades ago deep in the jungles of Laos, when everything he had learned and endured in training was tested in a matter of chaotic minutes. That day earned him the Silver Star for gallantry, though he never spoke of it. Not even to his late wife, Anna, who had passed 3 years prior. He was traveling today to visit his granddaughter for her college graduation in Seattle. She had always admired his service, though he rarely spoke of it. He didn't wear his medals, didn't speak in dramatic tones, and didn't like the label hero. He had simply done his duty. As Walt approached the gate, a younger flight attendant gave him a warm smile and a nod. "Good morning, sir," she said. "Do you need a hand with your carry-on?" "No, thank you, miss. I've carried heavier things," he replied with a faint smile. She didn't quite understand the depth of that statement. Unbeknownst to Walt, a few miles away, General Marcus Avery Richardson was arriving at the same airport. 4 stars sat on his epaulettes, earned through decades of leadership, combat, and diplomacy. General Richardson was heading to a defense summit in Washington state, and as always, traveled commercial when able, believing in sharing the burdens and spaces of the people he served. He was a no-nonsense figure, but not in the bark and shout way that movies portrayed. His strength was silent. He commanded respect, not demanded it, but like Walt, he didn't care much for special treatment. Back at the gate, an announcement crackled over the intercom. Flight 788 to Seattle will begin boarding first-class passengers at this time. Walt glanced at his boarding pass again, confirming his seat. 3A. He had been bumped up to first class, a courtesy offered by the airline due to his frequent travel and past service. It wasn't common, and he never asked for it. Still, when offered, he quietly accepted. As he boarded, he gave a polite nod to the crew. "Morning," he said with a voice that carried the weight of decades, but none of the ego. He placed his carry-on in the overhead bin, took his seat, and settled in. He gazed out the window as families, business people, and vacationers streamed past him toward the back. A few minutes later, a crew member leaned over to him, speaking just above a whisper. "Excuse me, sir, there's been an issue with your seat assignment." Walt turned from the window, confused. "An issue?" "Yes, it appears your seat was double booked. We're going to need to reassign you to a seat in economy." He blinked once, twice, as if not understanding. "I was confirmed for 3A. "Yes, but we had a late upgrade request from a frequent flyer with elite status. We sincerely apologize, but we'll need to ask you to move." Walt stared at her, his face unreadable. He nodded slowly, not one to cause trouble. "Of course," he said, gathering his things without protest. The attendant helped him with his bag, and he moved slowly toward the back. Passengers watched in silence, some with furrowed brows, some looking away in discomfort. No one spoke. No one offered their seat. No one knew who he was. 3 rows back, General Richardson noticed the exchange. He recognized the subtle limp, the sharp eyes of a man who'd seen things most couldn't imagine, and the humility that only true veterans carry. He didn't yet know his name, but he knew exactly what had just happened, and it didn't sit right. Richardson stood up, a man of stature and authority, and made his way toward the back where Walt had just squeezed into a middle seat. The murmuring in the cabin quieted as passengers sensed something out of the ordinary. "Excuse me," Richardson said, his voice calm but firm. "Sir, may I ask your name?" Walt looked up, slightly surprised. "Walt Thompson." The general's expression softened. "Walter Thompson, you wouldn't be the same Thompson from 5th Special Forces, Laos, 72. Walt's eyes narrowed. "Yes, sir, that was a lifetime ago." "Not to me," Richardson said. "I read your citation as a cadet. You saved your team under fire with no air support. You carried your commanding officer 3 clicks under enemy fire." Walt shifted uncomfortably. "I was just doing my job." Richardson turned to the flight attendant. "This man is a Silver Star recipient. You put him in economy for a travel upgrade." The attendant began to respond, but Richardson held up a hand. He stepped forward toward the front of the plane. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his voice slightly so it carried. "This man was quietly moved from first class to economy because of a booking error and a frequent flyer upgrade. He didn't complain, didn't raise a fuss, but I will." Silence fell, heads turned. "He served our country with valor most of us can only read about, and we just asked him to move to the back of the plane so someone with more credit card points could sit in his seat. That's not just bad optics, it's wrong." A pause. "I won't sit in first class until he does." A wave of whispers swept through the cabin. The passenger who had taken Walt's seat, a man in his 30s with earbuds in and a high-end briefcase, looked around, mortified. "Sir," he said quickly, rising to his feet, "of course he should have the seat." Walt tried to protest. "Really, it's not necessary." But the general shook his head. "With respect, Mr. Thompson, it is." As Walt returned to 3A, the plane's energy shifted. Passengers applauded quietly, some rising to shake his hand as he passed. He didn't smile. He didn't bask in the praise. He just nodded respectfully, grateful, but unsure how to feel about the sudden spotlight. Back in first class, he sat down again. Same seat, same view, but something had changed. The man next to him, a father with 2 children flying to Seattle for a family reunion, leaned over. "Thank you for your service, sir." Walt nodded, then returned his gaze to the window. Behind him, General Richardson returned to his seat, satisfied, but already thinking ahead. He knew this wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about the broader respect, or lack thereof, shown to those who served without asking for anything in return. What happened on that plane would not stay on that plane. The captain had been observing from the cockpit doorway, a clipboard in his hand, his brow furrowed. When General Richardson made his way back to his seat, the captain stepped forward. "General," he said, with measured professionalism, "thank you for addressing the issue. We appreciate having you aboard." Richardson nodded politely. "Thank you, Captain, and with all due respect, your airline has some serious internal reviewing to do." The captain nodded, a flicker of discomfort in his expression. "Agreed, we'll be submitting an incident report after takeoff." But the words felt hollow, more like procedure than principle. Meanwhile, Walt sat quietly, trying to disappear into the plush leather seat as if he could make himself invisible again. He didn't like attention, never had. The uniform, the medals, the commendations, they weren't trophies to him, they were reminders. Each came with the weight of men who hadn't come back. He had promised Anna, his wife, that he wouldn't let those memories rule him, but days like this made it hard. As the final passengers boarded, a young woman paused near Walt's row. She had seen the commotion and recognized his name when the general mentioned it. She approached hesitantly. "Sir, are you the Walter Thompson who served in Laos? My grandfather was in Special Forces too, James L. Parks." Walt turned, his eyes searching hers. Jimmy Parks, red hair, freckles, always carried a harmonica. The woman nodded, eyes already misting. "He was my best scout," Walt said softly, "could track footprints on concrete, saved my life more than once." She reached into her purse, pulled out a small, worn photo. This stayed in his wallet until the day he died. He always said Sergeant Thompson was the bravest man he ever knew. Walt stared at the photo, black and white, slightly crumpled, taken on some jungle hilltop. Both of them were in it, younger versions of themselves, faces smeared with dirt and exhaustion, but smiling. "He never told me he kept this," Walt murmured, his throat tightening. He handed it back gently. "Would you sign it?" she asked. "I want to pass it down to my son." He hesitated, then nodded. "Of course." As she returned to her seat in economy, others had taken notice. Several passengers were now looking at Walt differently. The man who once blended into the crowd was becoming a quiet focal point. The seat beside him was now empty. The previous passenger, whose upgrade had displaced Walt, had quietly requested a move to another section of the plane, perhaps from embarrassment, perhaps from discomfort. Either way, Walt appreciated the space. The doors closed with a mechanical sigh, and the crew began safety demonstrations. But no one was watching. Everyone was still processing what had unfolded. As the plane taxied toward the runway, General Richardson reached into his briefcase and pulled out his tablet. He typed a few quick notes, names, phrases, citations. He was already composing a memo for the Department of Defense. This wasn't going to be just another travel story. This was going to be addressed, officially, publicly. The plane lifted from the ground, climbing into a sky painted with late afternoon sunlight. Walt closed his eyes and leaned back. His body was tired, but his mind was alive with old memories. He remembered the day they took Hill 43, not a famous battle, barely mentioned in any book, but to the men who survived it, it had been a lifetime in 36 hours. Mud, blood, and sheer will. He had lost 4 good men that day, and earned his Silver Star, but no one back home asked about that part. They just wanted to know if he'd seen any action. His thoughts were interrupted by the return of the flight attendant, this time a different one, a younger man with dark hair and a kind expression. "Mr. Thompson," he said softly, "I'd like to personally apologize. What happened earlier was unacceptable." Walt nodded, acknowledging the gesture. "It's behind us." The attendant knelt slightly, lowering his voice. "My father served in Vietnam. He told me to always stand up for men like you. I didn't get the chance earlier, and I regret that." Walt smiled faintly. "It's never too late to do the right thing." The attendant stood, visibly affected. "If there's anything you need during this flight, anything at all, just say the word." Walt didn't ask for anything. He never did. An hour into the flight, turbulence gently rocked the cabin. People fastened their seatbelts, screens flickered, drinks were tucked away. Walt remained calm, unfazed. He'd experienced worse in rickety helicopters under fire. The calm was broken by a voice in first class. "Excuse me, are you Sergeant Walter Thompson?" Walt looked up. A man in his late 40s, athletic build, stood in the aisle. His eyes were red. "My uncle was in your unit, 5th Group. He told me a story before he passed, about a mission where you carried him and 2 others out under fire, said you were the reason he lived to have a family." Walt blinked slowly, recognizing the surname on the man's polo shirt, Hayes. "Tommy Hayes, Grenadier, took shrapnel in the hip." "Yes, sir," the man said. "He was my uncle, told us all growing up. Sergeant Thompson was the reason you're all here." Walt looked away, his throat tight. "You mind if I sit for a minute?" the man asked. "Please," Walt said. They spoke in low tones, reminiscing, remembering the fallen, laughing once or twice at the absurdities only soldiers understand. As the man left, he placed a hand on Walt's shoulder. "Thank you for my family." It was the kind of thanks Walt never knew what to do with. He simply nodded, silent. Elsewhere in the plane, General Richardson had connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi. He had sent the first message to his public affairs officer. "I want a formal review opened. Subject, veteran mistreatment. Media likely to pick it up. Let's stay ahead of it." His aide responded quickly. "Already trending on vet forums. Video from Economy went up 20 minutes ago. Has 60K views. Seat for a Silver Star." The general sighed. It had begun. An hour later, the captain made an unexpected announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been informed that a distinguished passenger aboard this flight has been the subject of some online attention regarding an earlier seating incident. The airline will issue a formal response. For now, we simply want to acknowledge the presence of Sergeant Walter Thompson, Silver Star recipient and U.S. Army veteran. Sir, we thank you for your service. Applause rippled through the cabin. Walt shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the recognition. He never sought applause. He just wanted to make it to Seattle, attend his granddaughter's graduation, and fly home. But that wasn't going to happen, not quietly. In the rows behind him, a retired Navy pilot tapped the shoulder of a flight attendant. "I'll trade him my seat. He deserves the front row." A mother with a toddler whispered to her son, pointing discreetly, "That man's a hero, like the ones in your books." The pilot wasn't wrong. Walt didn't just deserve the seat, he had earned it with his life, with his sacrifices, and with every quiet decision not to speak up over the decades when he had every right to. But this time, others were speaking for him, and he was listening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow through the windows, Walt finally reached for the small envelope he kept in his inside pocket. Inside it was Anna's last letter. He had read it dozens of times. Today, he read it again. "Walt, when you're tired, remember you've already carried more than most men ever will. And when the world forgets to honor that, I hope you speak up at least once, not for yourself, but for the boys who didn't come home." He folded it carefully, returning it to his pocket. Maybe this flight wasn't about him, maybe it never was. The lights in the cabin dimmed as the flight attendants began passing out dinner trays. Aromas of warmed chicken, pasta and rolls floated through the air, a small comfort in the sterile silence that had settled since the announcement. Walt declined his meal, resting his hand on his lap and staring straight ahead. The polite applause from earlier still echoed faintly in his ears, but not with pride, more with discomfort. He hadn't asked for this. He never did. From across the aisle, a young couple in business attire leaned forward. "Sir," the woman said softly, "we didn't realize who you were earlier. We saw the video going around. We just want to say thank you." Walt nodded once. "Appreciate that," he said, voice quiet. General Richardson watched from his seat several rows back, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the back of Walt's head. He wasn't surprised by Walt's modesty. He had met men like him before, decorated, battle-scarred, dignified in their silence, and often ignored in peacetime until something went wrong. He remembered his own first encounter with institutional disregard. A young officer, freshly commissioned, being mistaken for enlisted in meetings, called son by men who didn't bother reading his rank. He had fought through it, climbed despite it, but not everyone did. Not everyone survived the constant reminders that they didn't belong. As the attendants cleared trays, Richardson's aide quietly walked down the aisle and knelt beside the general's seat. He whispered just loud enough to be heard. "Sir, we've now got local news outlets picking up the video. It's hitting military social media hard. They're tagging Trans-Sky Airlines in every post." Richardson nodded. "Is the airline responding?" "Not yet, but it won't be long. Pressure's mounting." "Then let's make sure we stay ahead of it. I want a joint statement from my office and the Duty press team ready by the time we land." "Yes, sir." The aide stood and disappeared down the aisle. Richardson leaned forward slightly, making eye contact with the captain up ahead. There was a wordless understanding this wasn't going away. Back in economy, two teens watched the viral video on a phone between them. The clip, shaky but clear, captured Richardson standing in the aisle of the plane, raising his voice just slightly. A Silver Star recipient moved to economy while someone else took his seat. The comments section was already flooded. "This is what respect looks like." He didn't say a word, and still they tried to sideline him. "If this doesn't piss you off, you don't understand sacrifice." Walt didn't know any of this. He didn't have a Twitter account. His phone didn't even connect to Wi-Fi. He was of another era, an era where you served quietly and expected little in return. But now, that code of silence was being broken on his behalf. The teenager next to the two, watching the video, finally removed one of his earbuds and turned to Walt. "So sorry, I was in my own world earlier. I saw the video. You were a soldier." Walt looked at the boy, no older than 19. He saw the softness of a life not yet tested. "Yes," he said simply. "You really got a silver star." "Yes." The teen nodded slowly, a mixture of awe and confusion on his face. "What did you do to get it?" Walt turned his head toward the window, "More than I ever wanted, less than I had to." The boy didn't respond, sensing that was the end of the conversation, but he didn't put the earbud back in. He just sat in silence beside Walt, unusually still. At the front of the cabin, the lead flight attendant, Melissa, a woman in her early 40s with platinum hair and a tightly professional expression, was reviewing her incident report on a tablet. She kept glancing toward Walt's seat, guilt swimming beneath her composure. She hadn't known who he was. To her, he was just another elderly passenger in a wrinkled blazer and a quiet demeanor. She hadn't thought twice about moving him when the system showed a conflict, but now that conflict had a name, a face, and a story traveling faster than this plane. Another attendant approached. "Melissa, have you seen the news? It's blowing up." "I know," she muttered. "I didn't mean anything by it." "I don't think that matters anymore." Melissa closed her eyes for a moment, then set the tablet down. She walked slowly toward first class, stopping just short of Walt's seat. He turned toward her as she spoke. "Mr. Thompson, I'd like to apologize for earlier. I made a mistake, a poor judgment call." Walt studied her, not coldly, but with a weariness that made her words heavier. "I've had worse," he said. "But you shouldn't have to," she replied quickly. "I see that now." He nodded, not out of forgiveness, but acknowledgement. There was no point in dragging it out. Life had taught him that some people learn faster than others, and some only learn after the damage is already done. As she turned to leave, he added, "You're not the first, you won't be the last." The rest of the flight passed in a strange state of suspended awareness. No one slept. No one argued. Conversations were hushed, glances subtle, but everyone seemed acutely aware that something bigger than a travel delay was unfolding. In the cockpit, the captain received a direct message from airline headquarters. "Need immediate confirmation of passenger ID. Walter Thompson, Silver Star, incident confirmed, crisis PR team on standby." He sighed. They always care once it goes viral. As the plane began its descent, Richardson once again stood and approached Walt's seat. He crouched slightly so they were eye level. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "I'd like to escort you off the plane myself. The press is already at the gate. I'd prefer we manage this right." Walt looked at him, eyes narrowing. "Press?" "Yes, sir, and I'm afraid your story isn't private anymore, but I want to make sure it's told with truth and dignity." Walt let out a slow breath. "I didn't sign up for this." "I know, but maybe it signed up for you." As the aircraft touched down in Seattle and taxied to the gate, passengers began unbuckling, collecting their belongings. But this time, no one rushed the aisle, no one pushed ahead. Instead, when the seatbelt sign dinged off, they all remained seated. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated for just a moment longer. Sergeant Walter Thompson, Silver Star recipient, will be deplaning first, accompanied by General Marcus Richardson. Thank you for your cooperation and your respect." The general offered Walt his arm, which he took reluctantly. He stood slowly, spine straightening, as if summoned by a deeper instinct than age could touch. The years fell away in that moment. He didn't look 79. He looked like a man returning from battle. As he stepped into the aisle, the passengers began to rise, not in impatience, but in tribute. Heads bowed, hands clapped gently. A murmur of gratitude followed him to the door. At the jetway, a swarm of cameras and microphones waited. Flashbulbs, boom mics, a wall of noise. But Walt didn't flinch. The first reporter stepped forward, mic in hand. "Sergeant Thompson, how does it feel to finally get the recognition you deserve?" He paused, glanced at Richardson, then answered simply, "I didn't ask for recognition, I asked for respect. They're not the same." The cameras flashed like lightning as Walter Thompson stepped off the jet bridge and into the fluorescent-lit terminal, his every step shadowed by General Richardson. Reporters shouted questions from behind a red cordon, their voices overlapping in chaotic waves. "Do you plan to sue the airline? Are you angry about what happened? What does it feel like to finally be seen?" Walt didn't answer. He simply walked forward, calm and slow, like a man who had learned long ago not to run toward noise. The weight of 1,000 untold stories pressed on his shoulders, not just his own, but of every man he'd served with who never got to walk through a crowd like this. General Richardson held up a hand toward the press. "There will be a statement shortly. For now, give Sergeant Thompson space." Security personnel, now fully alert, escorted the two men past the growing crowd. Behind them, passengers who had shared the flight began filing out. Some were tearful, others simply silent. What had begun as a routine trip had become a shared reckoning. Waiting near the baggage claim was someone Walt hadn't expected to see so soon, his granddaughter Maya, early 30s, a college professor with her mother's quiet brilliance and her grandfather's poise. She was supposed to meet him the next morning, but somehow she was already here. "Grandpa," she said, pushing through a few camera flashes to reach him. Walt stopped in his tracks, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "I saw the video, the news alerts. It was all over social media. I left work and got the first ride here." He looked at her with something between pride and worry. "You didn't have to get in the middle of all this mess." "I'm already in it," she said, placing a firm hand on his arm, "and I'm proud to be." General Richardson stood beside them, watching the reunion with respectful distance. "She's a good one," he said, with a small nod. "Best of me," Walt replied. As they made their way to the arrivals lounge, a woman in a dark suit stepped forward. She wore the unmistakable badge of airline corporate, a lanyard with the logo of Trans-Sky Airlines, and a face trained in public apologies. "Sergeant Thompson," she began, "my name is Claire Jensen. I'm the Vice President of Customer Affairs for Trans-Sky. I'd like to extend our deepest apologies for the events on your flight. I'd also like to personally thank you for your service to this country." Walt eyed her carefully, reading her body language the same way he used to read enemy terrain. He saw the professionalism, the urgency, the fear of PR damage beneath the polished smile. "You're here because you're supposed to be," he said flatly, "not because you wanted to be." Jensen's smile faltered slightly. "We want to make this right. We're offering you a lifetime flight pass, full upgrades, and we're launching an internal investigation." Walt didn't move. "Will that bring back my friend Redman from the Jungle Ridge in '72? "No, sir." "Will it stop the next veteran who looks like me from being questioned when he boards first class?" Jensen hesitated. "We are implementing new training protocols and policy revisions." He sighed. "Policies don't teach respect, people do." She stepped aside, humbled. "Understood, sir." Maya led her grandfather away, past the velvet ropes, past the murmuring onlookers, past the headlines now scrolling across every screen in the terminal. "Silver Star veteran moved to economy sparks nationwide outrage." A car waited outside, a military sedan arranged by General Richardson's office, discreet and unmarked. Walt climbed in slowly, his knee aching from the long flight, though he said nothing. Maya followed, eyes darting to her phone as she scanned the growing media frenzy. Inside the vehicle, Richardson leaned forward. "The Secretary of the Army has been briefed. They want to recognize you formally during next month's Veterans Summit. You'll be introduced alongside Medal of Honor recipients and receive a Distinguished Service Award." Walt exhaled sharply through his nose. "Tell them I don't need a plaque to remind me of what I did." The general's voice remained calm. It's not for you, it's for everyone who never got the chance, and for the ones coming next. Walt looked at Maya. She gave a slight nod. That was enough. The drive to the hotel was quiet, aside from the occasional text ping on Maya's phone. Walt looked out the window at the city he'd visited only once before, Seattle, rainy, hilly, and full of young people who probably didn't know a damn thing about Laos or the kind of war that didn't make it into textbooks. He thought about the letters he used to write Anna during his deployments, how he'd always downplayed the danger, how he tried to keep the blood out of the pages, and how she knew better anyway. She would have had something sharp to say about the airline. She wouldn't have let him walk to economy without a fight, but she also would have told him not to carry bitterness. That's what had kept them sane all those years. At the hotel, the concierge greeted them with formality. "Sergeant Thompson, we've upgraded you to our presidential suite, courtesy of the Department of Defense." "I don't need anything fancy," Walt said instinctively. Maya stepped in. "It's not about need, it's about what's right." The suite was clean and spacious, with a view of Puget Sound. Walt sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his knee, while Maya moved around the room, setting down his small duffel bag, fluffing the pillows, always caring without being asked. She finally sat beside him, placing a hand on his. "They're going to ask for interviews," she said. "They'll want you to be the face of something now." He nodded. "I know. You okay with that?" "I'm not sure yet." She didn't push him, just sat with him, quiet as the early evening light dimmed through the window. A few hours later, there was a knock at the door. Richardson again, this time without aides or entourage, just a folder in his hand. "I spoke with Pentagon contacts," he said. "They want to use this incident to start a national campaign, one to better recognize and protect veterans, especially those from marginalized backgrounds. They're calling it Operation On a Seat." Walt chuckled. "Catchy, corporate came up with that." Richardson smirked. "Actually, it came from a young lieutenant in the social media office." Walt stood, stretching his back. "You think it'll actually change anything?" "I think it can, if people like you help lead it." He walked over to the window, looking out over the darkening skyline. "All I ever wanted was to be left alone, to serve, come home, and live quiet. But this world doesn't let quiet men stay quiet forever." Richardson handed him the folder. Inside were drafts of the campaign, sample PSAs, a proposed testimony to Congress. "You don't have to be loud," the general said. "You just have to stand where people can see you." Walt looked down at the pages. One bore his photo, now circulating online, him sitting upright in that cramped economy seat, his silver star pin visible beneath his blazer. He shook his head. "All that noise over a seat." "No," Richardson corrected. "All that noise over a man being made to feel he didn't belong in a place he'd earned." A long pause. Walt handed the folder back. "All right," he said, "let's do it, but I won't smile for the cameras." "You don't have to." Outside, the clouds parted briefly, allowing the moon to cast its glow over the city. Inside that hotel room, a quiet decision had been made. Not for revenge, not for fame, but for every soldier who had ever been pushed aside, doubted, or diminished after giving everything they had. The war was long over, but the fight for dignity was not. 3 days after the incident, the story of Walter Thompson had taken on a life of its own. What began with a quiet injustice in an airline cabin had become a national conversation. Major networks ran features on the Silver Star seat, while military blogs, veterans forums, and civil rights groups used his story as a rallying cry. Even Morning Talk shows featured blurred images of Walt's face on banners beneath words like "Dignity DNID, HONOR Walt sat in the back of a black SUV headed toward the Seattle Veterans Hall, where a press conference had been hastily organized by the Department of Defense. He had agreed, reluctantly, to make a public statement, not for himself, but because General Richardson had insisted that this was a moment that needed a witness. You've already changed more minds by sitting still than most people do screaming, Richardson had said the night before. Now dressed in a tailored dark blue suit Maya had picked out, Walt felt stiff and slightly out of place. The silver star pin glinted on his lapel right above his heart. He hadn't worn it in years, not since Anna's funeral. Beside him in the SUV, Maya reviewed note cards she had written to help him prepare. Just speak from the heart, she reminded him. You've already done the hard part. I'm not used to giving speeches, Walt muttered. You gave one at Mom's wedding, she said. That was 8 minutes long, and I cried through half of it. She smiled. That's what made it perfect. The car pulled into the side entrance of the hall. Security was tight. Press vans lined the curb, satellite dishes pointed skyward. Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation. Rows of veterans had taken seats in the audience, most in suits, some in uniforms, a few in faded jackets with patches and pins. As Walt entered, a hush fell over the room. A slow ripple of clapping began, modest at first, then swelling. Men and women stood, some saluted, others simply nodded. Walt took it in with a quiet reverence that felt heavier than applause. He had not come to be honored, he had come to be useful. General Richardson approached the podium first. His opening remarks were brief. We are not here today because a man wanted attention, he said. We are here because silence was finally broken, not by a shout, but by a quiet man who sat in economy and waited for justice to catch up with him. He stepped back and gestured to Walt. Walt took a moment at the podium. The mic was too high. Maya adjusted it with a smile before sitting down. He stared out at the sea of expectant faces. Veterans, journalists, advocates, and somewhere in the back, a young boy clutched a hand-drawn poster that read, "Thank you, Mr. Thompson." I was born in 1944, Walt began, voice steady. I grew up in Mississippi, back when separate water fountains and back doors were the law, not the exception. I joined the Army at 19 because it was the one place that told me I mattered, at least on paper. He paused, hands resting on the podium edge. I never fought for praise. I didn't serve to be thanked. I fought because there were men on my left and right who depended on me, and I served a country that didn't always see me, but I still believed it could. A murmur passed through the crowd, agreement, recognition, pain. When I got back, I didn't get parades. I got passed over for jobs, told I was overqualified or underqualified, depending on who was asking. I was denied a mortgage while my white brothers-in-arms bought houses with the GI Bill, but I didn't protest. I just lived, raised a family, paid my taxes, wore my scars like old boots, uncomfortable but familiar. The audience leaned in. Walt's voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. And then last week, I boarded a plane with a seat that my granddaughter helped upgrade me to. She saved for it, wanted me to fly in comfort for once in my life, but someone else's comfort was deemed more important than mine. He shook his head slightly. I didn't complain. I've been moved to the back my whole life. A silence thick enough to hear breath settled over the room. But someone else stood up, and when that happens, when people use their voice for those of us who have been trained not to, it reminds me that not all battles are fought with rifles. Some are fought with principle, with courage, with one person refusing to stay seated when the world says, "Stay silent." Walt looked directly at Richardson. General Richardson reminded me that the fight doesn't end when the uniform comes off. Sometimes it just changes shape. The applause came slowly, respectfully. No whistles, no cheers, just hands slapping together, steady and solemn. When he stepped down, Richardson met him with a firm handshake and a look of unspoken understanding. Maya wrapped her arms around him tightly. "That was perfect," she whispered. Afterward, during the meet and greet, dozens came forward. Some introduced themselves as veterans of different wars. Some brought grandchildren to shake Walt's hand. Others simply cried. A man in a brown corduroy jacket approached, removing his baseball cap as he neared. He looked to be in his 60s, with a face weathered more by regret than age. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Richard Monroe. I was one of the executives at TransSky who approved the loyalty seating structure. We never meant for this to happen, but I realize now that doesn't matter. I wanted to apologize to you personally, face to face." Walt studied the man's trembling hands. "Were you there?" "No," Monroe admitted, "but I created the framework that allowed it." Walt nodded slowly, "Then learn from it." "I will," the man promised. "We've suspended the program, reviewing everything." "Good," Walt said, "but don't stop at reviewing, start rebuilding." Later that evening, as the city lights sparkled below his hotel window, Walt sat in a chair by the glass with Maya's old laptop open on the coffee table. She had set up an email account for him earlier that year. It was now overflowing. Subject: "You're the reason I re-enlisted." Subject: "My dad served too, thank you for speaking." Subject: "You made my son understand dignity." He read each message slowly, carefully, his eyes misting over more than once. He didn't know most of these people, but somehow they knew him. One email came from a name he hadn't seen in 50 years. From Jack Cooper. Subject: "Been a long time, Sarge." Walt clicked it open. "I saw you on the news, never forgot you. I told my kids about you for decades. You saved my life. And more than that, you taught me what leadership really looks like. Hope to buy you a drink someday if your knee still works better than mine." Walt leaned back in his chair, overcome. He remembered Jack Cooper, young, hot-headed, always challenging orders. But when things went bad on Hill 33, it was Walt who dragged him out of enemy fire, bullet wound and all. They hadn't spoken since the day they were separated at Evac. He stared out the window, watching the moonlight shimmer on the bay. Something inside him began to loosen, a weight slowly lifting. He wasn't alone in this anymore. By the following morning, Walt's name had reached Capitol Hill. The clip of his speech at the Seattle Veterans Hall had gone viral overnight, and it wasn't just veterans and news anchors talking anymore. A congressional aide had sent it to her boss, who sent it to the House Veterans Affairs Committee. By 9:00 a.m., Walt's name appeared on a proposed witness list for an upcoming oversight hearing. When General Richardson arrived at Walt's hotel room that morning, he was carrying a garment bag and a briefing folder. "You're being asked to speak in front of Congress," he said bluntly. Walt looked up from his breakfast, black coffee and a half-eaten slice of toast. "Why?" "Because your story woke something up. The treatment of veterans, especially minority veterans, is under scrutiny again. They want you to testify about your life, about the flight, about everything in between." Walt stared at the general like he was speaking another language. "I'm not a politician, I don't wear suits well, I don't sugarcoat, and I sure as hell don't perform." "I know," Richardson replied, "and that's why they need you." Walt sat in silence for a long moment. Then, "If I do this, I do it my way. Wouldn't have it any other way." The general unzipped the garment bag and held up a custom-tailored black suit with a crisp white shirt and a deep blue tie. "They'll expect something like this, but you can wear your old uniform if you want." "I haven't put that on in 40 years, Walt said, chuckling softly. "Not sure it still fits." Richardson smiled. "It will." 3 days later, Walt stood inside the U.S. Capitol complex in Washington, D.C., wearing the uniform of a retired master sergeant. The creases had been pressed with care. The silver star sat on his chest, alongside a bronze star, a purple heart, and campaign ribbons that spanned 2 decades of service. The uniform didn't look outdated, it looked earned. Maya stood beside him, dressed in a simple but elegant gray dress. Her eyes were bright with both nerves and pride. Richardson, now acting as his official escort, had cleared every level of protocol to ensure Walt arrived without being swarmed by press or shuffled through like a prop. The hearing room was grand, paneled in polished wood, with the seal of the United States government etched above the raised dais where members of Congress sat. C-SPAN cameras were already positioned, microphones blinked red, rows of staffers whispered quietly behind laptops. As Walt entered, several of the representatives stood. Not because they had to, but because they knew they should. "Please take your seat, Sergeant Thompson," the committee chairwoman said. She was a seasoned lawmaker from Massachusetts, known for her relentless advocacy for veterans' issues. He sat slowly, his knee protesting slightly. The nameplate in front of him read, "Sergeant Walter Thompson, U.S. Army Ret." The chairwoman began, "We are honored to welcome Sergeant Thompson, whose recent experience has sparked national dialogue about how we treat our veterans, especially those from historically marginalized communities. Sergeant, the floor is yours." Walt leaned toward the microphone. He didn't fumble with papers. He had no prepared statement, only his story. "I'm not here to point fingers," he began, "but I am here to hold up a mirror." He scanned the faces in front of him, some curious, some solemn, some defensive. "I served this country for 26 years. I fought in wars that most people forget even happened. I trained young men to survive hell and led them into it myself. I've carried the wounded. I've buried the dead. And when I came home, I did what I was taught to do: shut up, work hard, and stay humble." He paused. The room was silent. But humility doesn't mean invisibility, and being quiet doesn't mean being blind. I've seen the systems that claim to support us: VA hospitals with year-long wait lists, job programs that skip over vets with the wrong skin color or zip code, policies that reward the loudest, not the most deserving. He straightened in his chair. "And then, last month, I got moved from a seat my granddaughter paid for because someone else's discomfort mattered more than my dignity. That wasn't just a seat on a plane. That was a reminder." Maya blinked back tears, listening. A reminder that even with medals on my chest, I could still be pushed aside, that my service still had fine print, that even after a lifetime of discipline and sacrifice, I was only welcome so long as I stayed invisible. The chairwoman shifted forward. Several other lawmakers did the same. "But I'm done being invisible, and I'm not here asking for special treatment. I'm asking for a baseline basic respect, not just for me, but for every veteran who doesn't fit the mold of who we are conditioned to picture when we hear the word hero." He finished, leaned back slightly, and folded his hands in his lap. There was no applause, protocol forbade it, but the silence was its own form of tribute. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "Thank you, Sergeant Thompson. Your words carry a weight many of us needed to feel today." Another congressman spoke next. "Sergeant, would you support federal legislation requiring airlines to honor seating accommodations for decorated veterans?" Walt nodded. "Yes, but don't stop with seats. Look at housing, healthcare, employment. Look at the full picture. The seat is just where people noticed. The rest of the story is happening every day." That afternoon, the clip of Walt's testimony hit the internet. Again, it spread like wildfire, this time not just among military circles, but through every demographic. College students reposted his quote, "Humility doesn't mean invisibility." Journalists wrote think pieces. Activists tied his speech into broader discussions on systemic bias. In a small town in Alabama, a middle school history teacher played the video for her 8th grade class. In a barbershop in Detroit, an old man who never liked politics watched it twice. And on a private farm in Tennessee, Jack Cooper, now 72 and retired from construction work, wept as he rewatched the testimony of the man who had once dragged him across a muddy battlefield under fire. Later that week, Walt received a formal invitation from the White House to attend a round table on veteran affairs. He declined politely. "I've said my piece," he told Richardson. "Now I want to see what they do with it." Instead, he returned home to Mississippi for the first time in years. Maya came with him. They visited the church where he had been baptized. The house he'd grown up in still stood, barely. The diner that once refused him service was now an art gallery. Time had changed the landscape, but not all the scars. That Sunday, Walt stood in front of the local American Legion post and addressed a small crowd of veterans. "Don't wait for someone else to speak for you," he said. "You've earned your voice, use it." After the gathering, a young man in his 20s approached. He had short dreads and wore a hoodie with the word resilient across the chest. "My dad was in Iraq," the young man said. "He died when I was 5. I never got to really know him, but after watching you speak, I feel like I understand what he stood for." Walt didn't say anything at first. He just reached out and shook the young man's hand, gripping it firmly. "Then he raised a fine son," Walt said. That night, back on his porch, Walt sat in his rocking chair, watching fireflies blink over the tall grass. Maya came out with 2 glasses of sweet tea. They sipped in silence. "You think it's over?" she asked. "No," he replied, "but I think it's beginning to matter." He looked up at the stars, quiet and bright above the Mississippi night. "There's more work to do," he said, "but this time I won't be doing it alone." The next time Walt Thompson flew, it wasn't in a commercial cabin. It was in a military aircraft, quiet, utilitarian, no champagne or wide seats, but to Walt, it felt like a return to something honest, something earned. The Department of Defense had arranged for his transport to Arlington, where he would participate in the unveiling of a new exhibit at the National Museum of the U.S. Army. The centerpiece, a section titled Invisible Valor, the story's history skipped. Walt's name was on the plaque beneath a display case that held a replica of the flight boarding pass that had started it all, alongside a copy of his Silver Star citation and an excerpt from his congressional testimony. He hadn't expected to be featured. He certainly hadn't expected the museum's director to call him the voice of a forgotten generation. As the plane descended toward D.C., Walt looked out at the land below, roads branching like capillaries across the countryside, rivers cutting deep paths through valleys. This wasn't his first time returning to the capital, but it felt different now. It wasn't just a visit, it was a reckoning. Waiting at Joint Base Andrews was General Richardson, as steady and precise as always. "You're on the schedule for a private tour, followed by a panel with veterans from every major conflict since Korea," Richardson said as they shook hands. "After that, you're free. I know you didn't ask for all this." "No," Walt said, climbing into the car, "but it asked for me." The exhibit was already drawing national attention. Schools were sending field trips. Journalists were writing essays. Veterans were bringing their grandchildren and pointing at Walt's photo like he was a chapter from a history book they'd lived but never seen written down. Inside the museum, the display was modest but powerful. Beside his section were names of other veterans whose stories had been documented too late or never at all. Private Curtis Williams, a black medic in World War II, denied a Bronze Star. Sergeant Alice Kim, a Korean-American radio operator from Vietnam whose battlefield promotion was ignored for decades. Walt stood before the wall in silence. "They're finally seeing us," he murmured. A voice spoke from behind him. More importantly, it said, "They're finally listening." He turned to see an older woman, no taller than 5 feet, in a blue blazer covered in pins. Her name tag read, Colonel Marlene Douglas, Ret. She had been a logistics officer in Desert Storm and one of the first black women to attain her rank in her unit. "I followed your story," she said. "It gave me the courage to speak up about things I let slide for 30 years. Walt smiled softly. "I know that feeling." They walked together through the rest of the exhibit, both noticing how much had been missed for so long. Later that afternoon, during the panel event, Walt sat among 5 other veterans, each from a different war, a different background, a different kind of battle. The auditorium was full, cameras mounted discreetly, students sitting in rapt attention with notebooks in hand. The moderator, a young Iraq veteran named Marcus Yates, began with a question aimed at the group. "What does dignity mean to you after service?" The microphone passed slowly. Some talked about housing, about healthcare, others talked about recognition. When it came to Walt, he paused before answering. "Dignity," he said slowly, "is the space between being tolerated and being valued. It's what you feel when someone makes room for you not because they have to, but because they believe you belong." He looked at the students in the front row. And sometimes, the smallest moment, a seat on a plane, a salute, A name remembered, that's enough to remind a man that his life mattered. After the panel, people lined up to meet him. One by one, they shook his hand. Some told him they had served. Others said they wished they had. Several just said thank you, then walked away quickly, emotion clearly too close to the surface. Back in his hotel room that night, Walt turned on the TV. A national news segment was airing, 1 year after the flight, how a seat sparked a movement. Images flashed across the screen, the flight, the testimony, the museum. His own face appeared more than once, older now, but still sharp-eyed and upright. He turned the volume down and let the images play without sound. He wasn't interested in hearing what people said about him. He was more concerned with what came next. That next thing came the following week, in the form of an invitation from the Pentagon. Operation On a Seat, the campaign sparked by Walt's story, had led to a new initiative, the Freeman Recognition Program, named not only for Walt, but in honor of all freemen who had served without the freedoms they were promised. The initiative would identify and formally recognize veterans, especially from minority backgrounds, whose valor had been overlooked or underrecorded due to systemic bias. It included a task force, scholarships for veterans' families, and a traveling archive of oral histories. Walt was asked to be the honorary chair. "I'm no politician," he reminded Richardson again. "You don't need to be, you just need to be present." Walt agreed on one condition. He wanted the program to include school outreach. "I want kids to hear our stories before it's too late," he said, "not from books, from us." The Pentagon agreed. Months passed. Walt traveled more than he expected, sometimes speaking, sometimes just listening. At one middle school in Chicago, he sat quietly at the back of an assembly until a teacher called him forward. He told the kids about growing up in the segregated South, about carrying wounded men through enemy fire, about coming home to a country that asked for his blood but didn't offer him a seat. "But I'm not angry," he said, "because anger turns to rust if you let it sit too long. I'm just here to remind you that every person you see has a story. Don't wait for a medal to listen." Afterward, a girl no older than 10 approached and handed him a folded piece of paper. "I drew you," she said shyly. It was a crayon portrait, Walt in uniform, standing beside a plane. The words above read, "Hero in every seat." He thanked her, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. That night, back in his hotel, he unfolded the drawing and stared at it. The smile that crept onto his face was small, but it stayed. One afternoon, while resting between events, Walt received a letter from a name he hadn't heard in over a year, Richard Blackwood, the man whose complaint had displaced him from his seat that day. The letter was handwritten. "Mr. Thompson, you may not remember me, but I remember you every time I board a flight. I've spent the past year reflecting on my assumptions, my privilege, my silence. I lost my job shortly after the story broke, and at first I was angry, but now I see it was necessary. I didn't see you as a person that day, just a problem, and I've carried that shame since. I don't ask for forgiveness, but I hope you'll accept my apology. I've joined a veterans support nonprofit. I tell your story every time we train new volunteers. I want to thank you, not for enduring what I caused, but for not letting it end there. With respect, Richard Blackwood." Walt read the letter twice, then a third time. He placed it beside the crayon drawing on his nightstand. Later that week, he spoke about it during a small veterans gathering in D.C. "Sometimes," he said, "the people who hurt us the most are the ones who learn the most, not because they're evil, but because no one ever asked them to look harder." He paused. "I don't carry resentment. It's too heavy. I carry reminders." And then, almost as an afterthought, reminders can become roadmaps. A year to the day after the flight, Walter Thompson stood alone on the tarmac of a small regional airport in Mississippi. No cameras, no flags, no crowd, just the sound of wind tugging at his blazer and the distant drone of a C-130 taking off. The memorial service for his closest friend, Thomas "Red" Redman, was scheduled to begin in less than an hour. Red had died quietly in his sleep, a month shy of his 80th birthday. There was no headline, no outcry, just a folded flag, a polished pine casket, and a few family members who still remembered him as more than a statistic. Walt had flown in without fanfare. He hadn't told the media. This wasn't for them. It was for the man who once pulled him from a ditch under heavy fire in Laos, using only one arm because the other had been shattered. It was for the man who never asked for praise, never boasted, and never stopped checking in, even after decades passed between calls. Walt sat quietly in the back row of the chapel as the service began. A chaplain spoke with grace. A granddaughter read a poem, but what moved Walt most was the silence, the respectful, reverent kind, the kind that made room for everything words couldn't say. After the service, he walked slowly to the casket, placed a small brass coin beside the folded flag, and whispered, "You got me through more than one war. Time to rest, brother." As he turned to leave, a middle-aged man approached. "Are you Sergeant Thompson?" "I am." The man extended his hand. "Red was my uncle. He spoke about you like you were a legend. He said you once ran 2 miles through enemy fire just to bring back a wounded private." Walt shook his head. "It wasn't a legend, it was just a Thursday." The man chuckled, but his eyes were wet. "He'd be proud to know you came." Walt didn't reply. Some moments didn't require words. He returned home later that evening, his mind full of memory, the kind that sneaks in through cracks and settles like dust on an old photograph. The house was quiet. Maya had stayed back in D.C. for work, and the silence gave him space. He made a cup of tea, sat in his worn leather chair by the window, and opened a small notebook he'd started keeping since the hearing in Washington. At first, it was just dates, names, places, but now it held reflections, scraps of thought he wasn't ready to say out loud. He flipped to a fresh page. Redman's gone, another chapter closed, but the war doesn't take everyone all at once. It takes us piece by piece, sometimes slowly, sometimes when we're not looking, but it never leaves empty-handed. He closed the book, set it down, and turned on the radio. A local public station was playing jazz, something soft and scratchy from an era that felt more honest. He let the music fill the room and leaned back, letting the memories come. 2 days later, he received a call from the Library of Congress. "Mr. Thompson, we'd like to formally record your oral history for the Veterans History Project. You'd be archived permanently, stories, documents, voice, everything." Walt hesitated. "Why me?" "Because the silence around men like you has lasted too long." He agreed, again, on one condition. "I won't sanitize anything," he said. "If I tell it the way it was. Exactly how we want it." That session took place weeks later in a small soundproof room lined with books and recording equipment. A young historian sat across from Walt, notebook in hand, eyes wide. Walt spoke for nearly 3 hours. He talked about his first deployment, about Anna, about the firebases in the jungle, and the nights spent with nothing but static and breath on the radio. But what lingered in the room longest was the part he saved for the end. "When I came home, I stopped wearing my uniform in public. Too many stares, too many questions, and none of the right kind. People thought they were being kind when they said thank you, but sometimes thank you sounds like, thank goodness you're not asking for more." The historian nodded, scribbling notes furiously. "But I don't tell you this for pity," Walt added. "I tell it because history has a habit of forgetting the parts that make it uncomfortable, and if I'm going to live long enough to be remembered, I want it to be for something real." His voice cracked slightly on the word real, but he pushed through. "I want young people to know we weren't just uniforms. We were men, women, people who believed in something bigger than ourselves, even when that belief wasn't returned." When the session ended, the historian reached across the table and shook his hand. "Thank you," he said genuinely, "not just for your service, but for trusting us with the truth." That night, Maya called. "The university wants to create a fellowship in your name," she said. "It would support students researching underrepresented voices in military history." Walt let that sit for a moment. "Call it the Redmond-Thompson Fellowship," he said finally. "I wasn't the only one who carried the weight." She smiled through the phone. "You got it." In the weeks that followed, Walt stayed busy, not with speeches or ceremonies, but with conversations. He began hosting informal gatherings at the local VFW hall. Veterans came from nearby towns, some in wheelchairs, some with canes, some carrying worn manila folders full of service records that had gone unnoticed for decades. They told their stories, and for once, someone was writing them down. One afternoon, a young woman in her 20s approached him after a session. She was wearing a denim jacket with a combat medic patch sewn onto the sleeve. "My father served with you," she said. "I never met him. He was killed before I was born, but I grew up with your name like a lighthouse." Walt smiled gently. "Your father was brave. We were all scared, but he never let it show." "Can I interview you for my thesis?" she asked. "It's about legacy." "You're already writing it," he said, "every time you tell someone where you come from." She hugged him tight and unexpected. He didn't flinch. Later that night, Walt returned home to find an envelope waiting in the mailbox. It bore no return address, just a single line on the back, "For what you carried." Inside was a photograph, him in first class on that infamous flight, his eyes closed, unaware that the moment was being captured. Tucked behind it was a handwritten note. "Your story reminded me that silence is not the same as peace. I see you now, the world does too." No signature, no clues, just words, weight, and a reminder. He placed the photo beside his medals, not above them, not below, just beside. That week he finally went into the closet and pulled out the old green duffel bag. Inside were mementos he hadn't touched in years, patches, maps, a rusted zipper with "Freedom Ain't Free" scratched into the side. And at the bottom, a folded piece of paper, a faded photograph of his squad, standing in the rain, arms around each other, soaked and smiling. He held it carefully, like something sacred. A new thought entered his mind, something small but growing. Maybe it was time to write a book. Not for fame, not for sales, but for the men in that photo. So they wouldn't be forgotten. So their children and their children's children could know that once upon a time, ordinary people did extraordinary things. Quietly, with no audience, just conviction. Walt Thompson sat at the old oak desk in his study, a yellow legal pad before him and a black ink pen in his hand. The desk creaked beneath the weight of history, not in the books or memorabilia, but in the man himself, hunched slightly forward, eyes narrowed in concentration. The light from a single desk lamp cast long shadows across his hands, which had once held rifles, lifted wounded soldiers, written letters to Anna, and now moved steadily across the page. He wasn't writing a memoir, not exactly. It was more like a collection of scenes, moments. Each entry was a snapshot, often without an introduction, sometimes without an ending, just glimpses of the world as he'd lived it. He titled the notebook simply, "Before They Forget." On one page, he described the taste of the dust in Vietnam after the monsoons. On another, he wrote about the time a young white officer apologized for calling him boy, not out of fear, but because he'd genuinely learned better. He didn't shy away from the dark. He wrote about the night he and Red had to leave a local interpreter behind because the medevac was full. He wrote about the nightmares, the smell of blood in jungle humidity, the days he couldn't speak to anyone, even Anna, because the weight inside him didn't have words. But he also wrote about joy. The time a unit of soldiers pooled their rations to bake a birthday cake out of canned peaches, protein bars, and sheer will. The way Anna's laughter could bring him back from 1,000 miles away with just a single recorded cassette. He didn't know if the book would ever see a publisher, but he knew Maya would finish it if he couldn't. The doorbell rang late that afternoon, unusual in his quiet neighborhood. He opened it to find a delivery driver holding a small padded package. From Washington, the man said. Walt signed for it, then opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a velvet box and a note from the Department of the Army. Sergeant Thompson, following a complete review of your service record and testimony, it is our honor to award you the Defense Meritorious Service Medal. This recommendation came directly from your peers and was unanimously approved by the department. With deep respect, Office of the Secretary of the Army. He stared at the medal in the box, shiny, formal, heavy. After a moment, he closed the lid gently, carried it to his study, and placed it next to a photo of Anna. You always told me I'd get what I deserved, but I think I got more. Later that night, Maya called. Grandpa, there's a film producer who wants to talk to you. He raised an eyebrow. Hollywood. Not exactly, documentary folks. Independent. They want to feature you in a series called Quiet Valor about lesser-known veterans whose lives changed policy. Walt rubbed his temple. I'm not sure I'm made for lights and interviews. You don't have to be polished, she said. Just be honest, that's what they want. He considered it, only if they film Red Story too. I'll make sure of it. A few weeks later, a small film crew set up in his living room. They didn't touch anything, they just adjusted lights and sat quietly as Walt told his stories. They didn't interrupt or guide him much, just asked questions like, what did it feel like to return home, or do you think anything's really changed? He answered slowly, never rushed. It's changed for some, he said, but change isn't a switch, it's a sunrise. It takes time to rise for everybody. The episode aired 6 months later on a major streaming platform. It wasn't flashy, no dramatic music, just his voice, steady and low, layered over faded photos, old film reels, and shots of Mississippi fields swaying in the wind. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in, strangers sent drawings, high school history teachers requested Zoom calls, veterans from long-ignored units wrote to say, now they can't pretend we didn't exist. Walt replied to each one, sometimes with full paragraphs, sometimes just with, I see you too. One morning, a package arrived from a small town in Nebraska. Inside was a collection of short stories, hand-bound, typed on an old typewriter, written by a man named Leo Hastings. Dear Mr. Thompson, I watched your episode. I served in Korea. Came home in 1954. I never told anyone what happened over there, but I've written stories in private for years. Thought maybe you'd understand. You gave me the courage to send them. With gratitude. Leo. Walt read them all, and when he finished, he picked up the phone. Leo, he said when the man answered, voice trembling with age. You should think about publishing these. Leo laughed. My hands shake too much to even sign my name, but if you want to pass them on, they're yours. A month later, Walt arranged for the stories to be archived with the Veterans History Project alongside his own. You're not invisible anymore, he wrote in his reply. None of us are. That summer, the Smithsonian invited Walt to attend a special event, the Voices That Rewrote the Record. They were honoring 10 individuals, soldiers, nurses, medics, and even a journalist who had brought attention to forgotten stories. Walt was the final speaker. He stepped to the podium, a little slower now, but just as composed. His hands rested on either side of the lectern. I never set out to rewrite anything, he began. All I did was sit in a seat I paid for. Laughter rippled gently through the audience. But that seat, he continued, wasn't just about comfort, it was about place, presence, saying I earned this and I belong here. He paused, letting the words settle. We talk about honoring veterans with parades, medals, speeches, but I'll tell you what most of us want, to be seen while we're still alive, not as symbols, as people, with names, faces, failures, and courage. He looked down at the front row, where Maya sat beaming, her phone filming discreetly. If I have one wish for the future, he said, it's that no veteran, no human being, ever has to fight for a seat they've already earned. He stepped back to a standing ovation. Outside, after the event, an older woman in a wheelchair approached him. Her hat was embroidered with the words U.S. Navy Waves. "I knew your wife," she said. "Anna, we were stationed near each other in '68. Walt blinked, stunned. "You knew Anna?" "She told me once she fell in love with a man whose quiet carried more weight than 1,000 speeches." Walt laughed suddenly, unexpectedly. "That sounds like her." The woman reached into her bag and pulled out a faded photo. Two women in uniform standing side by side, laughing. "She'd want you to have this." Walt stared at the image, overwhelmed. "Thank you," he whispered. As he walked away, Maya fell in step beside him. "You okay?" "I think," he said, "I finally am." That night they flew home, in first class, no confusion, no mistake. Walt didn't even sleep during the flight. He watched the clouds roll by, his thoughts steady. He no longer needed a spotlight, but he had found something even better. A place, a voice, a legacy, and the knowledge that sometimes the smallest act of dignity, a seat rightfully taken, can ripple out into something that changes the world. Back in Mississippi, the days grew longer and quieter. Summer melted into fall, and the heat eased off the porch steps like an old man stretching his joints. Walt Thompson settled into a routine that felt both familiar and new. Mornings started with coffee on the porch swing. Afternoons often meant short drives into town, not for errands, but for small moments. A talk with the barber, a slow walk through the hardware store, a quiet nod to other veterans at the diner. He'd become something of a local legend, not because of the medals or the flight, but because of how he carried all of it. With calm, with humility. He didn't wear his story like a badge. He wore it like a well-worn coat, warm, weathered, and never in the way. The book was nearly finished. Maya visited every weekend to help him revise chapters, organize old letters, and type up the handwritten pages. She would sit across from him in the study, reading aloud while he listened, sometimes correcting a detail, other times just nodding silently. One afternoon, she paused and looked up. "This part," she said, pointing at a paragraph, "where you write about Redmond covering you with his own body during a mortar strike. Do you want to add how badly he was injured?" Walt thought for a moment. "No, that part's not about the injury, it's about the instinct." Maya nodded, understanding. "You really think people will read this?" He looked at her and said, "They already are. Every time someone remembers our names, even in passing, they're reading it. This just gives them the whole page." The manuscript was titled, "Seats at the Table, Stories They Tried to Skip." Publishers had already shown interest. A small imprint known for literary nonfiction had offered a deal, but Walt hadn't signed anything yet. He wasn't writing for profit. He was writing to pass something down, and he wanted to be sure it went where it would do the most good. Meanwhile, the Department of Veterans Affairs had taken Walt's story to heart. In response to growing public pressure and bipartisan support, the VA announced the Honor Seat Reform Act, a bill designed to increase dignity-based protocols across public service agencies and transportation systems. It was the first legislation of its kind to be named after a living veteran, the Walter Thompson provision. The bill passed with rare speed. A televised signing ceremony took place on Capitol Hill. Walt was invited to attend, seated beside the Secretary of Veterans Affairs and the bill's original co-sponsors. When his name was mentioned, the entire chamber stood in recognition. He didn't speak that day. He didn't need to. The law spoke for him. But what mattered to Walt more than the law, more than the press, the events, the awards, was what came next. Schools began requesting copies of his book for their libraries before it was even printed. College professors wanted to teach it in classes. Veterans organizations began creating storytelling circles, inspired by his sessions at the VFW. And in Jackson, Mississippi, the airport installed a bronze plaque on the wall of the main terminal. In honor of SGT, Walter Thompson and every veteran asked to give more than they were ever promised. "Every seat earned is a place we must protect." Walt visited the plaque in secret one morning, early, before the travelers arrived. He ran his fingers over the inscription and whispered, "You're not invisible anymore, Red." Later that week, Maya received an email from a school district in New Jersey. A group of 8th graders had read about Walt's story in a civics unit and created a class project called Voices in the Aisle. It was a series of recorded student interviews with veterans in their families and neighborhoods. One student wrote, "Mr. Thompson showed me that sometimes you don't have to yell to be powerful, you just have to stand up and stay there." Maya read it to Walt on the porch. He smiled. "Kid gets it." That same month, Walt was contacted by an old army buddy he hadn't heard from in decades, Sam Tucker, a radio man from the jungle campaigns. "I saw you on the cover of the VA newsletter," Tuck said on the phone. "Had to sit down. Never thought I'd see your mug in glossy print." Walt laughed. "Still got that raspy voice, Tuck. Still got the scars too, but I heard what you did, and I want you to know something. Back then, when I thought nobody cared, you were the one who made me keep showing up." They made plans to meet again after all those years. Tuck lived just 3 hours away. When he arrived, walking slowly with a cane but grinning like he was 20 again, the two men embraced like no time had passed. "I still owe you a drink," Tuck said. "From that night we made it out of Hill 49. "You owe me nothing," Walt replied, "but I'll take the drink." They sat on the porch, two old soldiers, not reminiscing so much as remembering, putting pieces back together. "This porch," Tuck said, sipping sweet tea, "feels like home." "It is," Walt replied, "even if it took a lifetime to build." In early November, the President of the United States awarded Walt the Presidential Citizens Medal, one of the highest civilian honors. Not for combat, not for policy, but for moral leadership in public life. The ceremony was quiet, dignified. Held in the East Room of the White House, it included teachers, doctors, community leaders, and one man from Mississippi who had simply refused to be disrespected one more time. Walt accepted it with grace, then returned home the next day, back to the chair, back to the porch, back to the pages of his story. By winter, the first printing of his book had shipped. It wasn't a bestseller in the traditional sense, but in military circles, civic groups, and school curriculums, it was already being called a classic. One reviewer wrote, "This isn't just a memoir, it's a quiet revolution." Another called it a slow, powerful march toward truth. Walt didn't care much about reviews. He cared about one thing. When a boy at the local high school walked up after an assembly and said, "Mr. Thompson, you make me want to do something that matters." "You already are," Walt told him. "You showed up." That Christmas, Maya surprised him with a framed quote from one of his speeches, etched in glass. "The fight isn't over when the war ends. It changes shape, and sometimes it sits beside you in silence, waiting to be recognized." He hung it in the hallway, across from a photo of Anna, the one where she stood by his side in uniform, smiling like she knew everything before it happened. And maybe she did. As the year drew to a close, Walt stood in the backyard watching the last sunset of December bleed into the horizon. The wind was cool, the sky vast and soft with fading orange. He thought about legacy, not as something you leave behind, but as something you plant while you're still breathing. And he knew this much. He had not sought this journey. He had not asked for recognition, but he had earned something greater than a seat. He had earned his voice, and with it he had cleared a path. The new year began not with fireworks, but with a letter. It came in a white envelope, no return address, postmarked from Baltimore. Inside was a single sheet of paper, hand-typed on what looked like an old typewriter. The ink had the slight blur of age, as if it had been sitting in a drawer waiting to be sent. "Dear Sergeant Thompson, you don't know me, but my grandfather did. His name was Ellis McDowell. He served with you in Vietnam. I didn't know much about his time there until he passed. But when I found a box of letters he'd written but never mailed, I found one addressed to you. He called you his North Star. After reading his letters and watching your story online, I understood what he meant. Thank you for being the kind of man my grandfather believed in. Thank you for giving the world a better version of a soldier and a human being. With gratitude, Rhys McDowell. Walt sat with the letter for a long time. He remembered Ellis, a quiet, wiry man who had been good with radios and better with people. He once told Walt that some men followed orders, while others made people believe in the orders they followed. "You're the second kind," he'd said. He folded the letter, slid it into his notebook, and wrote one word beneath it: legacy. Later that month, Maya convinced him to attend a youth veterans conference in Atlanta. It wasn't a speaking event, just a gathering, informal, the kind of thing where people shared meals, swapped stories, and made plans for programs bigger than themselves. When Walt entered the hall, dozens of heads turned, not out of spectacle, but reverence. Some of the attendees were active duty, others were out like him. Many were younger: Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. A few had grown up with his face on the news or his story in their history books. They approached quietly, respectfully, like people entering a chapel. One woman in her 30s shook his hand and said, "Your testimony made me file a claim for the PTSD I'd been hiding for years. I thought strength meant silence. You taught me it doesn't." Walt nodded, not needing to say more than, "I'm proud of you." During one of the round-table discussions, a young Marine asked him, "What's the most important thing to carry with you after the uniform?" Walt thought for a moment, then answered, "Your memory and the memory of those who didn't get to carry theirs home." That night, back in his hotel room, he wrote in his notebook again, "We are not defined by what we endured. We are defined by what we remember and how gently we pass that remembering to others." The next morning, he gave that page to Maya and said, "Add that to the second edition." "Second edition," she smiled, already thinking ahead. He nodded. "If we're going to keep this alive, it can't just be about the past. It has to grow with the people who read it." Not long after, a university on the West Coast launched a special archive project in his name, the Thompson Initiative. It was a living archive, constantly updated, focused on collecting stories from veterans whose voices had been historically overlooked. Black veterans, indigenous veterans, women, LGBTQ service members, refugees who fought for citizenship. The project had one guiding principle: honor is only real when it's shared. Walt flew out for the opening event. He didn't speak this time, he listened, to story after story of courage wrapped in silence, finally unwrapped in safe spaces. Later, standing outside the lecture hall, beneath a wide California sky, a student named Amina approached him. She was studying military ethics and had recently returned from serving as a translator in North Africa. "I used to think my story didn't count," she said, "that I was veteran enough. You taught me that dignity isn't reserved for medals." "You were there," Walt replied. "That's enough." Spring brought a kind of gentle return. The town in Mississippi where Walt lived had slowly embraced its unlikely role in a national conversation. Local schools renamed their annual History Week after him. A mural downtown was painted, not of his face, but of a chair sitting upright under sunlight, draped in an American flag. Beneath it were the words, "Every seat earned." Walt saw it for the first time while driving home from the post office. He pulled over, got out, and stared at it for a long time. A couple passing by recognized him and nodded. He returned the gesture, still quiet. That evening, he called Maya. "I think I want to donate my medals." She didn't answer right away, all of them. He looked at the display case in his study, not just the silver star, but the Purple Heart, the Meritorious Service Medal, the campaign ribbons. "They don't belong to just me anymore," he said. "They belong to everyone who never got them, but deserved them just the same." The Mississippi Civil Rights Museum agreed to take them. They created a small, permanent exhibit titled, "The Cost of Quiet Honor." The case included a rotating video screen of Walt's congressional testimony and a panel of quotes from his book, letters, and interviews. Visitors often left notes on a nearby table. "I brought my father here. He cried for the first time in years. I've never seen myself in a museum before, thank you. This made me understand my grandfather's silence. One day, while visiting the museum in secret, Walt met a janitor named Carlos who approached with a gentle tap on the shoulder. I clean this floor every night, he said. Sometimes I just sit and watch your video. I never served, but my brother did. We lost him last year. You remind me of him. Walt placed a hand on the man's shoulder. Then maybe he's still here. As the weeks passed, Walt's health began to shift, not drastically, just in subtle ways he recognized, the fatigue that didn't go away, the stiffness in his legs that resisted the morning walks, the occasional tremor in his hands when he tried to sign his name. He didn't fear it. He just prepared. Maya noticed the changes too. She started visiting more often, making small changes around the house, updating medication lists, taking over more of the correspondence. She never said anything about what they both sensed. She just moved with the same calm precision he had once taught her. One evening, sitting together on the porch, she asked, "Do you think your work is done?" Walt took a long breath before answering. "No," he said, "but I think I've shown others how to continue it." They sat in silence for a while. The sun dipped low, fireflies blinked into the dusk. Then Maya reached into her bag and handed him a letter. This came today. It was from a senator. "Dear Sergeant Thompson, we are drafting a proposal to establish an annual day of recognition for unsung veterans, those whose service was not decorated, but no less vital. We would like to name it Thompson Day. Your example has reshaped how this country sees its soldiers. Please let us know your thoughts. With enduring respect. Office of Senator Delgado." Walt stared at the letter, his eyes soft. "I don't want a day," he said. Maya frowned slightly. "No." He looked out over the yard, where the grass swayed gently in the wind. "I want them to keep the promise, that's all." He folded the letter slowly and handed it back. "Tell them to make it about the people, not the name." Later that night, as the house quieted and the world turned beneath the stars, Walt opened his notebook one final time and wrote, "I didn't change the world, but I helped it look in the mirror, and that's a start." The morning was still when Walt Thompson passed away. There was no thunder, no cinematic final moment, just the quiet sigh of a man whose body had finally followed where his soul had already gone, toward peace. Maya found him in his rocking chair on the porch, wrapped in the same blanket Anna had once knitted, a paperback folded open on his lap, and one hand resting lightly over his heart. The sky above him was soft with pale gold light. Cardinals chirped in the trees. It was the kind of morning he loved, unhurried, honest, full of space to breathe. There was no note, no goodbye letter, just a life that had said everything it needed to and more. The funeral was held 5 days later at the same Veterans Hall where he had once spoken off script to a room of stunned onlookers. This time, the room was standing room only. Veterans from across the country came, men and women of every age, race, and background. Students came too, some who had never met him, but who had read his book or seen the mural or watched his testimony in a classroom hundreds of miles away. The ceremony began without pretense. General Richardson, now long retired but still sharp as a knife, delivered the eulogy. Walter Thompson didn't ask for attention. He didn't chase the spotlight, but the world couldn't ignore what he stood for because he stood so still, so tall, and so true. He paused, voice steady but heavy. He showed us that courage isn't always about what you charge into. Sometimes it's about what you refuse to back away from. He stepped aside and Maya took the podium. She wore a simple black dress, no makeup, her voice strong despite the grief. My grandfather never asked me to follow in his footsteps. He only asked that I never let anyone erase them. She looked out over the sea of faces. He carried the weight of memory, and when it got too heavy, he taught us how to carry it together. As she stepped down, a string quartet played a soft, solemn version of Taps. Then, as requested in Walt's will, the military honors were given flag presentation, 3 volleys fired in the courtyard, and the folded stars and stripes handed to Maya with quiet reverence. After the service, people lingered. They shared stories, laughed, cried. They ran their fingers across pages of his book and left handwritten notes in a memorial journal that filled up within the hour. One man, elderly and bent by years, whispered to Maya, "Your grandfather saved my life twice, once on the battlefield, and once when I was ready to give up after coming home." She placed a hand on the man's shoulder and simply said, "He saved all of us, one way or another." That night Maya returned to the house. It felt different without him, though everything was still in place. His books lined up in careful order, the rocking chair facing west, the framed photo of Anna watching over the room like a memory that refused to fade. She made tea, sat in his study, and opened his notebook one last time. On the final page, dated just a few days before his passing, he had written, "If I've done anything, let it be this, that no one sits alone in silence, wondering if their life meant something. Let the world remember we were here, that we mattered, that we left light behind us." She closed the notebook, her hands trembling. Then she picked up the pen he had used and wrote beneath his final words. "You did, Grandpa, you did." Weeks passed, then months. But Walt's story did not fade. If anything, it grew louder in the most unexpected places. On the first Thompson Day, renamed by Congress after Walt's passing despite his request otherwise, every VA hospital in the country held a moment of silence, not just for him, but for every veteran who had ever been moved to the back of the line, the back of the room, the back of the memory. Airlines installed placards at gates nationwide, marked with the silhouette of a man in uniform sitting in profile. The words beneath read, "This seat was earned, respect flies with it." And in a town in Mississippi, where history had once tried to forget, a new community center opened, the Walter Thompson Legacy House. It offered counseling, job training, storytelling workshops, and quiet rooms where veterans could simply sit and be seen. Maya oversaw its opening. She spoke briefly at the ribbon cutting. "This isn't a tribute to one man," she said. "It's a promise that no one will have to fight twice to be heard." The center's front door was etched with Walt's favorite line, "Humility doesn't mean invisibility." A few years later, a documentary aired on PBS, chronicling his life from childhood through war, through silence, through that fateful flight, and into the heart of a national reckoning. It was called The Seat That Spoke. The film ended with footage of Walt sitting on his porch, looking out across the fields at sunset. His voice, recorded months earlier, served as the final narration. We think legacy is about being remembered, but maybe it's just about what you leave in people. If they carry something better because you passed through their life, then maybe that's enough. And for so many, it was. Students began quoting him in graduation speeches. Veterans found the strength to come forward with their own stories. Entire curricula were rewritten to include the overlooked service of veterans like him, and Redman, and Alice Kim, and Curtis Williams, and thousands more whose names had once lived only in faded folders and dusty filing cabinets. In time, people stopped calling it the story of the flight. They started calling it the story that took off. And far from Washington, far from cameras and ceremonies, a little girl named Olivia, Maya's daughter, sat at that same oak desk, flipping through the original manuscript of her great-grandfather's book. She was 8 years old, reading slowly, carefully. "Mom," she said, pointing to a word she didn't understand, "what, valor?" Maya smiled and knelt beside her. "It means doing the right thing," she said, "even when nobody's watching, even when it's hard." Olivia thought for a second. "Like Grandpa Walt." Maya nodded, eyes misting. "Exactly like Grandpa Walt." Outside, the sun was setting, slow and golden and full. And inside that quiet house, a legacy continued. Not loud, but steady. Not famous, but unforgettable. Not gone, just passed on. Has this story moved you? If it did, don't let it end here. Somewhere in your town, on your street, maybe even in your own family, there's a veteran whose story hasn't been told. A man or woman who gave everything for a country that sometimes forgot to say thank you. You don't need a camera crew or a microphone, just your attention, just your voice. Honor can't be retroactive, it has to be present, active, alive, and that starts with you. Start by sharing this video. Not because we're asking, but because every time someone hears Walt Thompson's story, it becomes harder for the world to stay silent. Leave a comment below, maybe a thank you to someone who served, maybe a memory, maybe a simple "I see you." Let's fill this space with the names and faces that history tried to leave behind. And if you're someone who's worn the uniform, whether the world knows your name or not, this story is yours too. Your courage, your silence, your seat. So many people today are still being asked to move to the back, on flights, in offices, in society's invisible seating charts. But dignity doesn't take a ticket, and respect isn't reserved for headlines. It's earned quietly, day after day. Subscribe if you believe that stories like Walt should never disappear. Follow for more real, raw moments of redemption and justice, the kind that don't come wrapped in glory, but in truth. And most of all, remember this. The next time you board a plane, the next time you see an old photo in uniform, the next time someone says nothing, but their eyes say everything, ask yourself, have I made room? Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to look away.